I built a sign company where I can stay in one spot. So the way the billboard business works, there's different people playing different, I would call it games, because that's kind of how I look at all these things I do is almost like a game.
Shout out to all parents out there, because our words, sometimes we can be, critical on ourselves and think we should be better parents or something. But like, I believe, Conscious Investor, you were speaking words of truth and life into your kids, just like Chris's mom did, where it's like, you can do anything. And our kids are absorbing that also.
If you look at most people who accomplish stuff or that's successful, now, whether they'll tell you or not, I guarantee they failed all the time. They just didn't quit.
Welcome back, or welcome to the Conscious Investor Podcast, the show where we talk about health, mindset, and wealth building strategies. Today, we're going to have a really fun, eclectic conversation that spans from different types of real estate investing, including billboard advertising and affiliate advertising, to how do you transition and how do you navigate when things might go a little bit sideways. I'm so grateful to be joined by my friend Kris. He is phenomenal, and he is a massive go-giver. I can't believe if I send out a text and say, hey, Kris, do you happen to know somebody who does? And it might be something obscure. And Kris is like, here's somebody that I know. Like, he's so generous with just supporting the people that are around him. And so I'm grateful to call him friend. And I know that you're going to enjoy this conversation and you're going to gain and grow through it, because that's just how these conversations go. Kris, so grateful to have you here on the Conscious Investor Podcast.
Oh, thanks, Julie. Anytime I get to spend time with you, I'm happy. So
likewise.
Yeah. So I'm open to talk about whatever you want. So I'm happy to just be here and hanging out with you.
Well, I'm grateful to hang out with you as always. And I am going to open up with the question of all questions, the question that everyone gets asked. And that is, what do you do? And more importantly, how did you get started?
It's interesting because a lot of the stuff I do, they don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. Part of what I do, I kind of come from a niche real estate background in billboards, like you see along the highway. So pretty much I would go along the highways and I would determine where a billboard would work, where there'd be enough traffic count or people would pay enough to advertise on it. And then I would figure out a way to create a billboard structure there. So we would negotiate the land leases with the tenants, get all the permits, and then I'd have salesmen that would sell all the advertising on it. And so we might put 3 or 4 in on, like, say, semis would come in on like a Friday night. And then over the weekend, these billboards were installed. And then when everybody went to work on Monday morning, all of a sudden there's billboards there. And then those billboards would be sold to investors or other billboard companies. And, they would pay us for that. And then they just put their name on there. And then they would keep them for the duration of the lease. I was traveling, between where I live, St. Louis, and Chicago, doing that. But what happens is you keep having to go further and further and further because you can't put so many billboards in one spot because they're only legal in so many spots. So I started a sign company that pretty much worked with all the developments. And, like if you imagine like a strip center with a Target, that might have a sign in the parking lot that has all the different tenants for that development. My company would create those signs for those developments. And then every time a tenant moves in that plaza, we would handle all their signage. We do all their signage, the awnings. So we'll work with like some locations have like 30 or 40 locations, and we just keep duplicating them, primarily from St. Louis to Chicago, but ideally in the St. Louis area. And what happened was during COVID, they shut everything down. And, it was one of those deals. It's like the world's ending. Are we ever going to go back to work again? Are we even going to be alive? So I'm like, man, I got to figure something to do. I just can't sit here and can't leave my house. So I had a couple friends, and they were in the real estate space. Like I was doing billboards, they were flipping houses. And they had each flipped like, say, 100 houses. And I'm like, well, if they can flip 100 houses, through their career, I can flip 100 in a year. And I'm like, I know there's people out there just kind of doing that. And so I found people that were doing it. And so I started, I can't go anywhere. So I just started reading and studying. So I spent like thousands of hours studying these guys, and then started kind of building these systems, trying to figure out how to get leads, and then, getting people in the Philippines to work for me. And then what happened was, it's hard, trying to go through all that stuff. And my mom had passed away, and I was actually at her funeral, and I was sitting there talking to a guy, and he was talking about his friend built a Facebook group because he's a car guy. And he's like, I really want these certain types of cars, but I can't find them. So he's like, I'm going to build a Facebook group for cars. And then when anybody makes a post in there, I'll be able to see that post first. And then I can buy the car. I'm like, man, I wonder if I can do that for real estate. And I did. I built a group, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of working. And it was hard because I didn't know what I was doing. It's not like there's a book that I could read, but I just kept stumbling my way through. And then I'd build another group, and then kind of another group. And then actually, when I was down in Florida, where I originally met you, I was talking to a lot of people, and they were talking about like the Southeast, like having investments in, say, North Carolina or Georgia or Alabama or Texas or Florida. I'm like, if all these people want to have like big multifamily apartment complexes down there, I think it would make sense if I could build some groups down there. So that way I see all these deals, and then I'm the guy with all the deals. So I just started building groups in all those different states. And now I have probably about 375,000 people mixed over, I think about getting close to 30 groups, and each one's in a different state. And it's almost like a post a minute where somebody is making a post saying, hey, I have this house for sale. I have this strip center for sale. I have this apartment complex for sale. I have a mobile home park for sale. And nobody in the world sees it but me or the people who are helping me. So then we can look at it, and then we approve it to the group. And, like my Tennessee group, I think it's getting close to, I think, almost 180,000 people in that group. So it's just nonstop. And then I started setting these, I'm like, man, that's a lot of groups. I can't keep track of all this stuff. So I'm like, who would these groups benefit besides me seeing these deals? And so I started working with real estate agents. And so, like in Florida, I have maybe 4 different agents that help me man that 100,000 person group. And the idea is I introduce them to the group, and I'm like, you need an agent? Here's the agent. She can help you, or he, with everything you need. In exchange, they help me make sure the group stay clean, and they get to see the deals first. So if somebody's like, hey, I need an agent, well, the agents that are helping me, they can reach out to them before anybody even sees that somebody needs an agent. Or if it's a property that one of their clients is looking for. I mean, because there's only so much on the MLS. A lot of people aren't selling because the rates are so high. But if I'm getting 1,000 posts a day or whatever it is in a group, my agents that are helping me, they're seeing all these. So it allows them to have something that a lot of other people don't do. And a lot of these groups, these agents help me in multiple different states and multiple different groups because there's investors buying in all these states. And so that's kind of how it's going. I'm working my way across the country with that same model.
I just love watching how you iterate. And it seems like it looks like there's a dead end or there's a stop sign. And you're like, I don't know. I think I could go around the traffic. I think I could hang a right and maybe figure something else that's going to work really well out. So my question before we get into some of the nuances of the investing part of it would be, where did that ability to adapt, which one of my mottos is adapt or become obsolete. And so you're extremely adaptive. Remember Gumby when we were kids?
Yeah.
Like you're very adaptive and everything. And so is that just how you're naturally hardwired? Was that modeled for you? Where did that stem from?
I think it's from lots of failures because, I fail every day and all the time. And I think at an early age, I figured out, I could just give up and quit, or I could keep going. And I'm super competitive. And most of the people that I hang out with, they're competitive too, probably not as much as me with the exception of a few. And so I like to compete with them. And I'm like, man, if I stop, they're going to keep going. I got to keep up. And so my network kind of drives me, and then I'm learning things from them. So as I fail, I might be having a conversation with any of them or you, and I'm like, oh, wow, Julie's doing this. I'm like, okay, let me try that approach. And if it doesn't work, then I'll try a different approach. But I think it's just because I'm competitive and, I think I told you the other day, I'm kind of delusional, but I have a firm commitment, which my mom taught me when I was a kid. She's like, you can do anything. And I know a lot of parents, they tell their kids that, but this kid believed it. And my whole life, I've just always felt that there was nothing that I couldn't do. And I tell my kids that I'm like, there's nothing you can't do. And sometimes they look at me, I'm like, seriously, because that's how I believe it. Whether it's the case or not, I don't know, but it gets me where I'm going.
It's such a powerful belief. What's interesting to me also, and shout out to all parents out there, because our words, sometimes we can be, critical on ourselves and think we should be better parents or something. But like, I believe, Conscious Investor, you were speaking words of truth and life into your kids, just like Chris's mom did, where it's like, you can do anything. And our kids are absorbing that also. So we got to give as much airtime to some of maybe our missteps as we do some of the great things that we offer our kids along the way. So shout out to parents, especially your mom. And
I appreciate it.
Because it's literally one of those that changes the course and trajectory of your life just by you choosing to believe that.
If you look at most people who accomplished stuff or that's successful, now whether they'll tell you or not, I guarantee they failed all the time. They just didn't quit. Mm-hmm. I mean, they just kept trying and trying and trying. And their family might say, hey, you're crazy, go get a regular job, but they're like, no, I can do it. And then they keep trying. And when all hope looks gone, something happens and they made it. So I always find those stories inspiring to me. So.
I mean, I completely agree with you on that. The more opportunities we have for failure, it's more opportunities for success. And I always feel bad for people who aren't getting those reps in, because if you're not putting in the reps, will you ever be successful? It's that much further away, because you have to have the failures in order to get to the successes in life, for sure.
Yeah, I know with me, sometimes something, say something's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And sometimes when the right thing happens, I almost get let down inside, because that means I don't get the challenge of trying to correct it, because sometimes I enjoy correcting whatever the issue might be. So, I mean, that might be another thing that separates how I do things than other people. Because sometimes, or a lot of times people, it really bothers them when something doesn't go wrong. Whereas me, sometimes I get excited because it's an opportunity to try to figure out how to make it go right.
So would you self-characterize as being obsessed then with the process versus the outcome?
100%. Honestly, I think I have more fun going through the process than receiving the benefit. And I do that, I like cars and I like, working on cars or motorcycles and doing all that stuff. And sometimes I'll get one that's a huge project. And I'm like, man, I can't wait to do this, 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 and this. But when I get done with the project, I can go drive it. But I'm like, oh, man, the fun part was doing all the thinking, laying in bed, trying to think, oh, how am I going to do this? Or how am I going to do that? But when it's all said and done, it's up and running, then almost like boredom sits in. And I want a new challenge. So if that makes sense.
Every time I put together a Lego set with my son when he was young, I was always disappointed. I'm like, but I don't want this to end, because I'm liking this hangout time. Yes. And we're doing something and we have a path and a plan. Yes. And it's fun and it's interesting. And yeah, I completely resonate. And Conscious Investor, maybe you resonate with, you're listening to a great audiobook or reading a good book and it comes to an end and you're like, but I still want more.
Yep, 100%. Yeah. Like I might be watching a TV. I mean, I don't watch much TV, but say, I end up watching a TV show and then you get the final episode and it ends. You're like, now what? I was in that journey. I want to go further. I want to keep going. So the stuff that I do, I'm always searching for that longer journey or new horizons. The bar keeps moving.
Yeah. So this is interesting because And I want to go, I want to go like 5 different directions right now, but I'm thinking about
Sure.
where we began with, I'm out of college and now I'm, in the billboard space and developing my billboard company and my sign company. And then years later, I hit the COVID wall and I iterate and I create these groups because I'm going to flip houses now. We'll start flipping houses and create the groups, right? So you have this arc, right? This really cool arc in your life. Like, if you were to look at the horizon, like what are some of the interesting things that you would say, well, it'd be fun to try or explore? Is there anything on the horizon that just, lights you up?
My goal is eventually be in a position where I can just travel and then let my mind wander, where I'm not actually in the grind. I'm more just managing the grind. And I can do more thinking because, I love to think. But I think that would kind of be the end, is when everything is running like a fluid motion. And I mean, even though I like fixing when an issue arrives, there is kind of peace when you build something and it's running, and you can still be there and manage it. But when everything's fluid, and I have lots of little goals every day. I have little goals, and then I got big goals, and I'm checking them off. But what happened is, as fast as I check them off, I have new ones that just get on there. And I think that's probably an entrepreneurial trait, maybe. I'm sure. I mean, you end up doing lots of things too, so I think you would probably, understand kind of what I'm saying, I guess. So, but I might end up talking to you and you're doing something. I'm like, man, that sounds fun. I'll tell you a story, and goes back to kind of being delusional. I was with a buddy of mine. Now, I grew up doing sports my whole life, but I was never like a runner or a biker or a swimmer. I mean, I did them all as a kid playing and stuff like that, but I was sitting one day, this might have been 15 years ago, with a buddy of mine, and he just did a triathlon. It was a sprint tri. And he was telling me the story. He's like, man, I had to ride like 25 or 30 miles. And then I ran like 5 or 6 miles, and I swam like a quarter or a half mile. He's like, man, it was great. And he did all this, and he told me his time. I'm like, man, that's so awesome. I said, I'm going to do one, because I was like in the movie with him. And he started laughing at me. He's like, you can't do that. And I'm like, yeah, I can. He's like, well, you don't ride, you don't swim, and and it lit a fire in me. I'm like, oh yeah, well, we'll see. So I mean, that's the problem with me, is I get so fired up that I want to. I'm like, all right, I'll show you I can do anything. And sure enough, I think that day I started training. But the very next day, or not the very next year, I did the exact same triathlon that he did, and I beat his time.
That felt so good, I bet.
Oh, yeah. And it wasn't that I wanted to beat my buddy. It was more to show my buddy that I really could do anything I tried to, and that he could too if you just try hard enough. So I'm just glad that's the only event that he was talking about. So
he's like, I'm doing an Ironman next year in 6 months. You want to do it with me?
Yeah.
It's a full Ironman.
Yeah. Well, I got another buddy who does that, and he's really good. So I don't talk to him as much. It keeps me, otherwise who knows what I'd be doing. So I would get off track. That's for sure.
It's true. But there's something about when people tell you, and I'm the baby of the family. So I have 3 older brothers. And so, always wanting to try to keep up and, exist in the world of where my brothers exist, basically, so that I can exist. Right. And it's like, I have to prove it. I have to prove, I have to show up. I just have to make this happen and be brave and try and be daring. And there's something to that when people say no to highly motivated individuals who, to me, it's like the healthy rebel. They're unhealthy rebels where they kind of flip the world off, and they're like, they go off the rails and don't tell me I can't drink or do drugs or party.
Oh, sure.
You have that kind of, in rebel, but then you have some that are like, no, I'm going to do all these great things in my life and nobody's going to stop me.
Sure. Yes. And I would be that one, because I've never cared what people thought. Forget you, I'll do it. It's more just to kind of prove something to myself. Yeah. I think a lot of times it's more to prove something to myself. And I've always, I remember And as a kid growing up, I was drag racing all the time. And I was always breaking my cars or blowing motors. The very first transmission I blew, I was drag racing an imaginary Ferrari because the guy that was with me told me he was in a Ferrari and it was faster. I'm like, oh yeah. And I'm going through the gears and I blew my transmission. I'm like, oh my God, I just blew a transmission racing a car didn't exist just to prove to this guy. And so I've had those issues. So, being competitive.
It is, I think it's pretty fun. I mean, I created my growth summit just because I needed to prove something to myself. So a lot of times I do things just to prove to myself, like, no, you can do these things. You can serve people in these ways. You can anything you want. You can create as many Facebook groups and you can figure out the systems and the organization and you can flip 100 houses. Let's go for 1,000 houses this year. Why not? Right. So
yeah, I feel the same way, but I think you actually, you made a point that answered a question you asked me is part of the reasons, how I got to how I am and is how I think you said that you got to how you are being the youngest, because I was the baby in my family, so I would have siblings that are 20 some years older than me and one of five. So as I grew up, everybody was like adults. They're doing everything. And so I'm a little kid. I'm like, I can do that. Of course I couldn't. So I would figure out ways to do it. And I think that's kind of what started me on the path was trying to keep up, with the older siblings and stuff like that.
That's really fascinating. And I know that there are so many studies out there on birth order and character traits of the babies and things like that. But it is very interesting. I want to shift gears and I want to go two different directions. And I'm going to be mindful of time. One direction I would like to go is billboards. Future of America. I mean, like, is that still something where do you still play in the arena, and is it still an interesting place?
For me, I built a sign company where I can stay in one spot. So the way the billboard business works, there's different people playing different. I would call it games because that's kind of how I look at all these things I do is almost like a game. Just like say a person's in single family houses. You got one person's like wholesaling, another person's like a fix and flip, another person's like a buy and hold. Well, in the billboard business, I was more like a developer, almost like somebody developing subdivisions. And you can only develop so many subdivisions in, say, one town.
Right.
Because there's only so many people to move into those. The other game in the billboard business is you put them up and then you keep them and then you maintain the advertisers on there. To me, it didn't seem as exciting once I created something from nothing to just stay there and try to sell ads. And so that's why I kept going further and further away so I could constantly get that little adrenaline. Let's see if I can create one here. Maybe I can create one there. And each one brings a new meeting with a new city or, a new meeting with a new, person. They could own like a tall building, or they could own like maybe an apartment complex, or they own a strip center, or they own a farm. Each one was a different person. And I was really excited about that. But what happened is I kept having to go further and further away to do that. So, and the only way I could stay home is if I kept them and filled them with ads and then played the rental game. And then all of a sudden you start competing with each other. And then instead of like when I would go talk to somebody to sell an ad, they're talking to me. And it's different than if somebody's calling me because they see a phone number on there, because if they're calling me, they're seeing 10 other billboards with a phone number on it. So you can't get near as much for that when somebody's just price shopping everywhere. So that's part of the reason I transitioned more to like an on-premise where I can do big LED signs. Like we'll do big LED signs for like strip centers and plazas and stuff, but I can stay in one spot and I can just drive within 30 minutes and I have all the work I'd ever want. And then what happens is I get in with these developers. A developer might own strip centers all over town. Every time somebody moves into that strip center, I get a phone call and it makes my world so much easier. And I can create systems and processes. So like, as I'm sitting here talking to you, my company's running, so people are, getting bids or doing artwork and all that stuff. So I kind of transitioned more. I mean, so I don't play in the billboard space as much anymore. I can, but it's quick and it's a much easier process to do what I'm trying to do with my on-premise instead of doing the billboards, even though I can do them. And man, there's a lot of money in it, but I just, I'm not in a situation where I want to be jumping all over focusing on that right now. Plus, I'm working on these groups. I'm trying to free up my time so I can work on those. And then I have somebody running, my other stuff.
This is really fascinating because this really goes with where you're, when I asked you about the arc of life and stuff, you are intentionally building it. And even the fact of, okay, I'm not doing the billboards and I can see the fun of it. Like it's game, it's sport, it's a hunt. There's adrenaline with it.
100%.
There's something meaty to it. And once you have it built and you've done the negotiations, you've leased up the land and you've gone through all the hurdles of it, it's like the Lego set that's built now. And it's kind of boring, just like, okay, well, let me put my little Lego guy over here. All right, now he's going to have a cup of coffee and we'll put him over here. Like, kind of boring. It's kind of like, okay, it's done. So I can totally see why you love your family. And so I'm like, oh, all of this makes so much sense, right?
Yeah, and it's the same thing with these groups. I can sit anywhere. I can sit in a coffee shop anywhere, and I can manage. Yeah. So I have 375,000 people making posts, but I can manage it all from my phone, my iPhone.
Wherever you are.
Anywhere in the world. If I travel, it's right there. And so years ago, I set off to kind of build the life I wanted with a plan. And part of my plan was I wanted to be able to be anywhere I wanted to go and be able to do what I wanted to do. And so that's, but when I was younger, some of the things I did, they were I didn't have a plan. I was just kind of doing.
Yeah.
And things were pulling me in different directions. I'm like, oh, okay, let's go over there. So once COVID hit, that was kind of the first time in my life I was really like, okay, I have a direction and this is where I'm going to go. And this is my why. Mm-hmm. And so fortunately I met you and, so I can learn from you along the way.
Okay. So. I know we need to wrap this up here in a moment, but I want to ask you this final question, which really it all like dovetails together, I think, beautifully. And that is, you're creating the space where you can have time to think, and you're already experiencing that because right now we're having this conversation and everything is running in the background, doing what it should be doing because you've built in a very, prudent way. So what does Kris think about? Like, I know I love thinking and I think that you might resonate with this, but I like being in my own mind. It's a fun place. I like hanging out with myself and I like hanging out with all the information I've put in there and playing with it. So like, what do you like to think about?
Now bring this back to your husband. The other day I saw a post. He was sitting on a porch and he had a pipe in his mouth and it was something to the effect of sitting and thinking. Do you ever take the moment to just sit there and think? And, I liked it. And I went to try to comment. And I think his question it was similar to kind of what you said. And I was having a hard time answering. So I couldn't respond to his post. But I love to sit and think because I love how my mind works. Because I can go so deep in my mind that I'm actually somewhere. I'm actually doing what I'm thinking. But I like thinking about like adrenaline stuff. Like I love like dirt bikes and riding dirt bikes or fast cars or, I want to build like a 1969 twin turbo Camaro. So I've been thinking about that all the time. And actually on that subject, I told my family about that and they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, and we're going to start out, we're going to go to a junkyard, we're going to pull a motor out of an Escalade and we're going to take this motor apart. And all of a sudden, a few weeks later, my son and me are at a junkyard and I'm cutting an Escalade apart, pulling a motor out. And he's like, I don't know what's going on, but there's a lot of oil. But, I'm taking them on a completely different journey that has nothing to do with what I do, just so they can see. So I like thinking about actions and stuff besides work. I can think of work all day long and I can go so many directions, but if I'm not actually working, that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about is adventures that I can go on or things that I can get excited about.
I think most people do well to allow themselves to go down those rabbit holes deeply because what we think about does become our reality because our mind is so focused on it. And so it's guard your mind and go deep into the good stuff.
I want to know what Julie thinks about.
Oh gosh, I think about the reality is I realize that I'm a philosopher, which sounds really like
Yeah.
lofty to say. But over the last year, I realized that I am a philosopher. And I love thinking about how people think about things, why people. So I love, going down sociology and philosophy and psychology and I am consumed, and this won't surprise you, conscious
Hmm.
investor. I'm consumed with human potential and the intersection of faith and
Hmm.
human potential in general. And so my mind is always going down those rabbit holes. We look at Steve and I, we say we're going to have we just need to, and we started doing this recently, just hitting record on our phones, on our conversations, because we have these crazy cool
Oh.
conversations. We said that we should have cocktails and conversations and not
Hmm.
cocktails, plural, conscious
I,
investor, just a cocktail. Because we like to enjoy a cocktail in the evening and we have these really we think they're fascinating conversations. And I think they
it
are.
sounds like another podcast.
We've toyed with this a bit, right? And so like being able to look at human nature from the beginning of time to present time to where does that go, or looking at generations and the characteristics of
Hmm.
different generations and how that's had a domino effect in different ways. So I nerd out thinking about those things, but then Super Rad Steve also nerds out on very similar things. And so it's a lot of fun.
That's amazing. Just curious, do you ever listen to, have you heard of like Graham Hancock? You'll see him on like podcasts. I think he had something on the History Channel.
No, who is
Have
it?
you ever, he's kind of, now the people listening might be like, you don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what he technically is, but I know he's not a scientist. He's not like an archaeologist, but he's more like a researcher, almost like a reporter in a way, but he doesn't necessarily believe everything that we're being told by the mainstream media. So he goes and he figures out how the world works based on other things. And like he'll go to Egypt and he'll go to like the Amazon rainforest and he looks at like ancient cultures and how they lived and how they did stuff. He's really interesting. If you haven't heard of him, you should just look him up because he's really entertaining to listen to as he talks about the world around us that a lot of people, they're too busy even to think about. But he's been on like Joe Rogan's podcast. I don't know if you've ever listened to Joe Rogan or not, but I'm a big fan.
He's fun.
But that's where I originally found him. But yeah, so he's an interesting guy to listen to, his beliefs on the world and stuff.
I will go down that rabbit hole. And it's so fascinating when you just simply step back and you allow yourself to think. But I want to, a conscious investor, I want to encourage you on this. So you can see Kris and I, our squirrels, our down the rabbit holes are very different, but it's also the same at the same time. It's just where your mind goes, but it's learning and training yourself and saying, it's okay for my mind to go down this rabbit hole. And so find your rabbit hole to venture down because it trains other parts of your mind and it allows you to just simply flourish in life. It's super, super cool. Yeah,
no, I would agree with that 1000%.
Gosh, Kris, I always appreciate hanging out with you and our great conversations. I know that you have different ways what are the best ways where if people were interested in your Facebook groups and such, or they're like, Kris, how do you build all this? Like, how can people hang out with you?
The best thing they can do, if you go to grandchateauproperties.com, I don't know if there'll be a link in your show notes.
We will.
You can find me through there and you can see all my groups and you can see some of the different things. And one of the things I didn't bring up, say you're an investor, if you're in one of my groups, say you have questions about creating an LLC or taxes. I have different relationships with different companies. You can get an hour free conversation. And they'll talk to you for an hour just for being a group member. So there'll be like a link in the group in like the featured section where you can ask all your questions. They're actually, a lot of times these guys are live. I created chats in my groups where people can ask these questions. I also have a lending relationship. So say you're doing an apartment complex or strip center, any of that stuff, you can connect with, say, 1,000 different investors that are each one separate from the other, all in my group. So there's links for that. If you have a short-term rental, I got hundreds of items for a short-term rental. Everything's in my group. You can just click on and see all the items 4-star reviews. So there's lots of different things. You just got to click there and kind of bounce around, and you'll see me because I'm in all these groups. Just say hello. I love to meet new people.
That's such a great way of getting to know new people. And you also have the group, which they could access through all of this, right? Is where you can, as a private investor, you could go and you're looking for a new investment. You can go and look at investment opportunities. Or if you're an active investor, you have a means of presenting your investment opportunities as well. But I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah. And on that, there's I think a capital raising event where you can get in front of some of these hedge funds or some of these like family offices coming up. So in other words, if you're part of like the lending platform that we're partners with, that gets you in there where you have the opportunity to possibly get your deal in front of some of these family offices, or people that have a lot of fun. So there's a lot of opportunities, and everything like in my groups and stuff is free. I mean, so unless you just say, I want to buy something, but just to poke around and see what states you're interested in, go for it.
That's so awesome. We'll have a link down in the show notes, Conscious Investor. We'll make it as easy as possible for you. Kris, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for hanging out. And thanks for, you are a go-giver. It's not a surprise to me that you offer so much to, in building communities, and you offer so much, complimentary for free, right? And because that's really indicative of who you are and how you do things. So thank you for being a go-giver.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Julie.
Awesome.
And thanks for having me. So
it's always great. Conscious Investor, remember, life is a limited time offer. So live well. Okay. So this next week, make sure you go live in the fullness of the freedom. And you can create that freedom just by creating space in your mind. That's where it's going to start.